the next panelist, and I would like to thank Nikki. That was just amazing. I just love the idea that you're speaking 10 minutes, without all your notes, and then boom. So I'm really happy to introduce Frédéric Gros. He's a doctor in philosophy. He's a former student at the École Normale Supérieure of Rue d'Ulm. At Sciences Po, he holds a position of university professor, teaching political humanities to first-year college students and contributing to the master degrees program in political theory. His research primarily delved into contemporary French philosophy with a special emphasis on Michel Foucault's teaching. Gros has edited several of Michel Foucault's courses at the Collège de France and has extensively studied topics such as the right to punish, war and security issues, and the ethics of political subjects. Currently, his scholarly focus is on examining shame as a political emotion. I love that as an idea. And today he's going to talk about why France hates Michel Foucault. And I love that. Nikki talked about how Michel Foucault sometimes is seen nowadays as a woke theorist. And I think that Frédéric Gros has much to bring to us in this discussion. During the Q&A afterwards, if some of you wants to ask questions in French and English, I will help some translations. We are certainly to discussion here. So his presentation will be in English, but at the end, it will be a collective work again. So join us.
Thank you so much. So, why does France hate Foucault? This title may seem paradoxical and even quite exaggerated, given that I'm pronouncing it today in the midst of many French, excuse me, chronometer, yes. So, in the midst of many French colleagues who have written remarkable books on Michel Foucault, and both their work and their presence here testify to a love of the text that is as keen as ever. Yet, this provocative title seems justified. Indeed, for some years now, perfectly unabashed anti-Foucault aggression has been manifesting itself in France. It has been expressed by many intellectuals and academics on television and in newspapers, as well as in essays and academic articles. This aggressiveness is increasingly insistent. It is a part of a new French battle, the fight against wokeism. And in France, wokeism is really presented as a dangerous theoretical plague, an intellectual epidemic straight from the USA, threatening the fragile heart of French identity. A new totalitarism, un nouveau totalitarisme. So I'm going to start with a selection of quotations, distinguishing between media intellectuals characterized by their presence on the TV sets, for example, Michel Onfray or Luc Ferry, and official intellectuals endorsed by intellectual institutions such as the major publishing houses and the Académie Française in France, and finally, a number of researchers and academics recognized for their expertise. So first, one example of media intellectual. In February 2022, Luc Ferry appeared before the French Senate, devant le Sénat, devant des sénateurs. So he appeared to talk about the crisis of citizenship, crisis of la crise de la citoyenneté. And Luc Ferry tried to explain the current crisis to the senators, and he denounced what he called the deconstruction of transcendent values, la déconstruction des valeurs transcendantes. And he deplores the disappearance of both the great Republican ideals and the great Christian religious landmarks. And Luc Ferry asserted that this loss of values, cette perte des valeurs, has been accompanied by a withdrawal of each individual into his own person. And this egoistic withdrawal takes the form, and this time I am quoting Luc Ferry directly, so the form of the care of the self that Foucault, says Luc Ferry, that Foucault so foolishly advocates, so foolishly advocates. So Michel Foucault is presented devant les sénateurs, before the Senate of France, as the theoretical guarantor of contemporary individualism and narcissism. First, two, I'd like to turn to an official intellectual, Pierre Nora, an academician, the Foucault's historic editor at Éditions Gallimard. In his latest book, Une étrange obstination, Pierre Nora writes that Foucault has, and I quote, Foucault has, in a highly intellectualized way, has announced and prepared the post-truth regime. So, you know, Foucault's philosophy is now suspected because of its skeptical relativism of being one of the causes of our entry into the age of fake news. It's due to Foucault. Three, as a final example, Stéphanie Rosa, a researcher specialized in the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, has no hesitation in asserting that, and I quote, Foucauldian opposition to the legacy of the Enlightenment is a fundamental fact of his thought. Opposition to the legacy of the Enlightenment. And Michel Foucault, in her book, becomes the philosopher who rejects humanism, progressivism, and rationalism. So I finished with the direct quotations. But of course, there are many, many other television and radio appearances, books, articles that could be quoted in recent years. Here are a few of the most eloquent titles of these writings against Foucault. Post-truth philosophy. The Islamo-leftist does exist, and I met him, Michel Foucault. If we now take all these statements and map them out conceptually, I believe we find three main charges. The three main charges. First, moral political nihilism. First. Secondly, epistemic relativism. And three, historicist irrationalism. Firstly, politico-moral, where is my, yes. Politico-moral nihilism. Politically, Foucault is accused of having both demonized power and multiplied its forms. Foucault's political thought is regularly summed up by his detractors in two assertions: that he obviously never supported himself. Firstly, power is evil. Secondly, power is everywhere. And this thesis of multifaceted and diabolical power would nourish two major contemporary denunciations. Firstly, that of the perpetual oppression of minorities. Secondly, that of the systemic nature of discriminatory attitudes. And these two accusations, they say, these two accusations, repeated over and over again, are suspected of instigating a detestation of the rule of law. Foucault is thus accused of having totally ruined our confidence in a French Republic that is naturally egalitarian and supportive. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Morally, excuse me, but it's difficult for me to speak in English. Morally, he's regarded as the inventor of those theoretical tools that have made it possible to denounce the processes of normalizing behaviors. However, this critique of the norm, say the anti-Foucault text, is devastating because it led to two valorizations in the ethical field. Firstly, the valorization of eccentricity, transgression, and anti-conformism. Secondly, the valorization of a totally asocial and anti-civic preoccupation with oneself. This time, Foucault is accused of being le complice objectif, the objective accomplice in the moral collapse of the young French generations, systematically described as being without reference points, without limits, and without identity. Due to Foucault, there is no longer any right or wrong, man or woman, normal or abnormal. Secondly, epistemic relativism. After the values of right and good, it's the value of truth that Foucault is said to have rendered obsolete. Philosophy itself is threatened, but it is not the individualistic relativism of truth that is denounced. Foucault is accused of making truth dependent either on an historical epoch through the concept of episteme, historicist relativism, or on a social device through the concept of power knowledge, sociological relativism. In each case, what is ruined is the autonomy of the discourse of truth, the independence of its foundation, the principle of its legitimate superiority over error or opinion. From the moment truth is no longer thought of as something that depends solely on its own necessity, all is equal in a catastrophic relativism, a relativism that leads to the collapse of all values, to fanaticism and war. So you see, epistemic relativism immediately communicates with moral political nihilism. Thirdly, historicist irrationalism. This time, Foucault is accused of allowing universal reason to drown in the swamps of history, of avoiding any normative posture in favor of a genealogical stance that merely discredits the most respectable institutions or values. This charge of irrationalism is an old one, having already been brought by Habermas in his Discours philosophique of modernity. But today it has been taken up by a number of defenders of the French Enlightenment who consider that Foucault's critique of Western reason is ruinously anti-humanist and anti-progressive. So, before defining the issues at stake in these attacks on Foucault in the current French intellectual world, I'd like to point out that Foucault himself was perfectly aware of the possibility of these reproaches, and that he himself problematized them. Indeed, these grievances are taken into account on two occasions. With regard to historicism, on February 1966, at the Collège de France, he claimed as his method what he called his political historicism. And he says, yes, je suis un, ma méthode, c'est l'historicisme politique. But this political historicism establishes against what ce qu'il appelle, what he calls the Platonic tradition. Political historicism establishes the idea that all true knowledge is always traversed by a relationship of forces. First, and in 83, in a handwritten passage from the January 5 lecture, Foucault writes that nominalism, nihilism, and historicism always have been instruments for disqualifying discourse, and that the only way to counter them is to make a historicist and nominalistic and nihilistic analysis of this discourse of disqualification by the universal. But by nominalism and historicism, Foucault does not mean theoretical negativism, but a positive operation of substitution, substituting historical experience or practices for theories, transcendental, etc. But now let's get back to these attacks orchestrated by today's French establishment, intelligentsia, etc. Basically, it seems to me that these attacks on Foucault can be approached in two ways, philosophically and ideologically. Philosophically, on the one hand, and I'll come back to this point in my conclusion, it could be said that it is often the Nietzschean inspiration of his thought that is attacked. Indeed, French philosophy has always loved to identify itself as Cartesian. As a result, with the exception of the 60s and the 70s, it has always approached Nietzschean thought with a great deal of mistrust. Now, ideologically, on the other hand, these attacks are based on a second pillar. The second pillar of French identity after Cartesianism is l'universalisme républicain, Republican universalism. And it may seem a contradiction in terms, but France spontaneously considers universalism, which it calls republicans, to be a national specialty as the one. We have the wine and the universalism. On the sheet, so three great specialities of France. So from depuis le cartésianisme to Republican, yes, the words too difficult, I pronounce them in French. Donc du cartésianisme à l'égalitarisme républicain via the progressivism and the Enlightenment and the universalism of the Declaration of the Rights of Man during the French Revolution, France claims a rational, republican, and secular universalism as constitutive of its cultural identity. From then on, any critical thinking that dares to question the limits of an overhanging universalism, the risks of dogmatic rationalism, or the inadequacies of an obtuse secularism, immediately appears anti-republican and ultimately anti-French, anti-Français. The media and official intellectuals who today denounce the wokist threat of the Enlightenment specialists who present themselves as the theoretical guarantors of the secular republic all denounce Foucault's supposed anti-universalism. So the point is to present Foucault as a detractor of the French Enlightenment, enemy of Republican universalism, adversary of Cartesian rationalism. So the problem, however, is that it is quite impossible to make enemies of the Enlightenment either Foucault or Nietzsche. If you read the text, it is impossible. The long unpublished pages Foucault devoted to Nietzsche in the mid-50s have been rediscovered in the manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and they will be published at the end of May. And they show that reading Nietzsche was for Foucault a brutal jolt, a saving tremor, a jolt that awakened him from his phenomenological slumber in the same way that Hume had awakened Kant from his dogmatic sleep. And it was with Nietzsche that Foucault discovered that philosophy is not an instrument for the rational foundation of universal values of justice and truth, but a critical instrument for denouncing systems of belief and domination. Reason, truth, and justice must not become idols of thought to be worshipped by philosophy. Philosophy is a critical power that is at once funny and painful, tragic and coming. And Nietzsche claims himself, Nietzsche, that it was the French Enlightenment that awakened him from the romantic slumber into which Wagner's music and Schopenhauer's prose had plunged him. So Voltaire's wicked irony and Diderot's tempestuous immanentism, but, says Nietzsche, especially not Rousseau's complaint, no, not this, but Voltaire and Diderot, yes, open his eyes to his own destiny. In conclusion, I would simply like to say that the contemporary legacy of the Enlightenment is not univocal. In the same way that Jonathan Israel, in a famous book, distinguished between radical and moderate enlightenment, the contemporary legacy of the Enlightenment should be understood as profoundly dual. On the one hand, there is a Republican, universalist heritage that privileges the Enlightenment's affirmation of secular rationality, humanism of human rights, and the defense of the rule of law. But on the other hand, there is another heritage that privileges in the Enlightenment freedom of thought, critical materialism, and the tracking down of domination in all its forms. But it's not because you criticize reason that you're necessarily an anti-universalist irrationalist. It's not because you criticize the will to truth that you are a fanatical obscurantist. I would therefore like to conclude with a double refusal. No, secular and republican universalism à la française does not have a monopoly on the lesson of the Enlightenment. And no, Foucault is not the sworn enemy of the Enlightenment. He is the representative of that current of Enlightenment that Spinoza and Nietzsche had traced before him. So, if France hates Foucault, the great thing is, I think, I hope, that Houston loves Foucault. Merci. Merci, Nikki. Merci, Rice University.